In the frozen tension of the early Cold War, when Europe existed as a fault line between two nuclear-armed civilizations, and every military strategist believed World War III might erupt at any moment, a small office within the British War Office conceived one of the most shocking, secretive, and surreal defense plans ever devised. A plan so catastrophic in scope, so bizarre in execution, and so morally volatile that even today it seems like something torn from a dark satire rather than official NATO policy. This was Operation Blue Peacock, a classified program developed in the 1950s in which the United Kingdom, in coordination with its NATO partners, prepared to bury 10-kiloton nuclear landmines beneath the soil of West Germany, designing them not to destroy advancing Soviet tanks in a conventional sense, but to detonate entire regions, leaving behind irradiated wastelands stretching for miles, permanently uninhabitable barriers, meant to carve trenches of radioactive fire across Europe if the Red Army marched west. The logic was as ruthless as it was simple. If the Soviets invaded, NATO forces would be overwhelmed, outnumbered, and fast collapsing. So when every other line of defense inevitably failed, the buried nuclear charges would detonate, shattering infrastructure, poisoning groundwater, rendering cities unlivable, and creating impassable zones of devastation designed to stall the Soviet advance long enough for NATO to regroup or prepare a full-scale nuclear retaliation. Each buried nuclear mine weighed nearly 8 tons and contained a plutonium core capable of producing an explosion larger than the bomb dropped on Hiroshima. They were to be sealed within reinforced steel casings, wired with anti-tamper mechanisms, temperature regulators, pressure sensors, and remote triggers, all buried so deeply that Soviet forces would have no chance of detecting them. But what made Operation Blue Peacock truly unbelievable was not simply its reliance on using nuclear devices as landmines. It was the chilling reality that these bombs were intended to detonate within Allied territory, turning West German farmland, villages, forests, and entire landscapes into radioactive scars stretching from horizon to horizon, all justified under the grim calculus of deterrence, in which NATO planners believed that sacrificing a portion of Germany was preferable to losing all of Europe. And yet, even this disturbing premise was overshadowed by the program's strangest detail. The engineers responsible for designing the buried nuclear mines faced a practical problem. Buried underground, insulated from sunlight, and exposed to frigid winter temperatures, the landmine's sensitive firing components and plutonium core could freeze, risking misfires or total failure. The official solution proposed in internal documents was astonishing: to place live chickens inside the nuclear mines. The idea was that within the sealed steel chamber of the weapon, the chicken's body, heat would keep the environment warm enough to prevent the electronics from failing. A small supply of feed would keep the animals alive long enough, roughly a week, until the expected Soviet invasion triggered detonation. It sounds like parody, like something a cynical comedian might invent to mock Cold War paranoia, yet the documents were absolutely real, stamped top secret, and approved through multiple layers of military bureaucracy. This bizarre combination of apocalyptic nuclear firepower and barnyard heat generation came to represent not just the desperation of NATO's defensive strategies, but the surreal extremes military planners reached while standing on the edge of global annihilation. But before the chickens, before the steel casings were forged, and the West German burial sites surveyed, before the ethical debates tore through classified committees, the story begins with the British Army's deep fear that Europe was not merely vulnerable to Soviet invasion, it was practically indefensible. West Germany, the geographical heart of NATO's European front, offered no natural barriers against a mechanized Soviet assault. The Fulda Gap, the North German Plain, and the Bavarian Corridor all provided wide, flat, tank-friendly entry points from East Germany into NATO territory. Intelligence reports across the 1950s painted the same grim picture. If the USSR launched a full assault, Soviet tank divisions would pour across the border in waves numbering tens of thousands, supported by artillery, rapid infantry mechanization, and air superiority in the opening hours. NATO, still rebuilding from World War II, lacked the manpower and armored strength to meaningfully resist. The fear was not hypothetical, it was foundational to NATO grand strategy. British defense planners understood that no matter how well-trained or technologically advanced NATO forces were, they could not withstand the sheer numbers the Soviets could deploy. Within days of an invasion, West Germany would fall, and NATO command projected that by the time reinforcements arrived from the United States, Soviet troops would be positioned deep inside Western Europe, potentially threatening France, Belgium, and even the English Channel. The result was a wave of panic-driven innovation. If NATO could not stop the Soviet advance through conventional means, perhaps it could slow or deter it using something far more devastating. Thus, the concept of atomic demolition munitions, or ADMs, emerged, a class of nuclear devices specifically designed to shape or deny terrain, block mountain passes, destroy bridges, or contaminate choke points. Operation Blue Peacock was just one branch of this broader strategy, but it was by far the most extreme and most ambitious. Instead of detonating a nuclear device to destroy a single bridge or tunnel, Blue Peacock envisioned burying massive nuclear bombs across hundreds of square miles, creating a network of potential atomic craters stretching along key invasion routes. If the Soviets crossed into West Germany, NATO commanders could remotely trigger the weapons or instruct on-site demolition teams to arm the mines manually. In theory, the resulting chain of nuclear blasts would not only annihilate Soviet divisions, but also produce radioactive fallout so intense that it would render entire regions impassable for days, weeks, or longer, possibly even years. The moral implications were staggering. Millions of West German civilians lived within or near the proposed blast zones, and even those who survived the explosions would face displacement, radiation sickness, poisoned farmland, and a homeland reduced to post-nuclear ruin. Yet within the war rooms of 1950s NATO, this kind of sacrifice was seen as necessary, even inevitable. After all, from the perspective of London or Washington, Germany was the front line, the shield behind which the rest of Europe and the Western world depended. Better to lose a piece of Germany, they argued, than to lose everything east of the Rhine. And so the development proceeded, carried by the feverish anxiety of an era when policymakers genuinely believed nuclear war could erupt at any moment. The weapon itself, initially referred to as the Blue Bunny before being renamed Blue Peacock, was a monstrosity of engineering, more than 7 feet long, encased in inch-thick steel, weighing over 7 tons and containing a plutonium implosion core similar to the British Blue Danube bomb. It possessed 2 detonation modes, a timed explosion, allowing troops to withdraw, or a tamper detection mode in which any attempt to move or disarm the mine would trigger detonation. British engineers estimated that if deployed in clusters, 10 Blue Peacock mines could obliterate vast Soviet armored formations and turn the North German plain into a radioactive desert stretching for miles. But as winter testing simulations began, an unexpected obstacle emerged. The electronics could not operate in freezing temperatures. heating the mines with batteries or fuel sources proved too dangerous or unstable. The sealed interior created a thermodynamic nightmare, until one scientist, either inspired or deranged depending on interpretation, suggested an organic solution: chickens. The birds, trapped within an insulated chamber, would generate enough metabolic heat to prevent the weapon's sensitive components from freezing. The idea was proposed completely seriously, approved seriously, and written into the official documentation with a level of bureaucratic formality that makes the entire affair even more absurd. It is in this bizarre juxtaposition, plutonium warheads relying on poultry-based climate control, that Operation Blue Peacock becomes more than a historical oddity. It becomes a window into the Cold War psyche, a time when rationality, fear, ingenuity, and insanity often merged indistinguishably. And all of this, the nuclear landmines, the chicken-warmed triggers, the plans to irradiate German soil, the panic of NATO generals who believed they would be overrun within days, remained hidden from the public until the documents were declassified decades later, prompting historians and military analysts to re-examine not just the operation itself, but the terrifying world that created it. As Operation Blue Peacock moved from abstract theory into concrete planning, the reality of what NATO was preparing to do began to unsettle even the hardened military professionals tasked with executing it, because the program demanded not only engineering brilliance, but a moral numbness that could justify turning Allied territory into a nuclear kill zone. Classified meetings held between British defense officials, NATO commanders, and atomic scientists revealed an unspoken understanding that if the plan was ever activated, it would permanently reshape Europe in ways no treaty or reconstruction effort could undo. And yet the fear of Soviet invasion was so overwhelming that these concerns were often brushed aside as secondary to survival itself. British intelligence estimates from the mid-1950s predicted that a Warsaw Pact assault would begin with overwhelming artillery barrages, followed by armored spearheads driving westward at speeds NATO forces could not match, and war games repeatedly demonstrated that conventional defenses would collapse within 72 hours, leaving commanders with only nuclear escalation as a viable response. Unlike strategic nuclear weapons aimed at cities or missile silos, Blue Peacock's atomic landmines were designed as battlefield weapons, meant to detonate beneath the feet of advancing armies, vaporizing roads, bridges, rail junctions, and supply routes in a cascading sequence of radioactive destruction that would choke the Soviet advance, while simultaneously poisoning the terrain so thoroughly that no force, enemy or allied, could safely traverse it afterward. The idea was to create what planners referred to as area denial zones, massive contaminated belts that would buy time for NATO to regroup or escalate to full nuclear retaliation, even if that meant condemning entire regions of West Germany to decades of abandonment. Engineers calculated blast radii, soil composition, fallout dispersion, and groundwater contamination with chilling precision, determining that a single 10-kiloton detonation could contaminate farmland for miles and render nearby villages uninhabitable, while clusters of mines detonated together could create overlapping zones of lethal radiation that would halt even the most determined armored assault. These calculations were not theoretical exercises. British scientists conducted extensive modeling to determine how radiation would spread through river systems, how prevailing winds might carry fallout towards civilian population centers, and how long contaminated zones would remain deadly to human life. Some projections estimated that certain areas could remain unsafe for generations, effectively erasing communities from the map. Yet the documents show remarkably little concern for civilian evacuation plans, largely because planners assumed there would be no time to evacuate anyone once the invasion began. In their minds, Blue Peacock was not a weapon of choice, but a weapon of desperation, intended to be triggered only when all other options had failed. As development progressed, the British Army began surveying potential deployment sites across West Germany, focusing on known invasion corridors like the North German Plain, the Fulda Gap, and key transportation hubs that Soviet forces would need to seize in order to maintain momentum. These surveys were conducted discreetly, often under the guise of routine engineering assessments, with only a handful of German officials aware of the true purpose behind them. Even among NATO allies, knowledge of Blue Peacock was tightly compartmentalized because British officials feared political backlash if the plan became public. After all, asking West Germany to host buried nuclear bombs designed to destroy its own territory was diplomatically explosive. The secrecy was so extreme that many senior NATO officers were unaware of the project's existence, and those who were briefed were often sworn to silence under the strictest security classifications available at the time. Within the British War Office, debates erupted over the feasibility and consequences of the plan, particularly after scientists raised concerns about the weapon's reliability and control mechanisms. One of the greatest fears was unauthorized detonation. What if Soviet forces discovered the mines and attempted to disarm them, triggering explosions prematurely? What if a technical malfunction caused a mine to detonate accidentally? What if communications were disrupted and commanders lost the ability to control the weapons remotely? To address these risks, Blue Peacock was designed with multiple redundant safety systems, including coded arming procedures, pressure-sensitive triggers, and fail-deadly mechanisms that would ensure detonation if tampering was detected. In effect, the bombs were engineered to explode under almost any suspicious circumstance, a feature that reassured planners worried about Soviet interference, but horrified others who recognized how thin the margin for error truly was. Then there was the problem of maintenance. Buried deep underground, the nuclear mines would require periodic inspection to ensure their components remained functional, yet exposing them risked detection or accidents. British engineers wrestled with how to balance accessibility with concealment, ultimately proposing that the mines be installed shortly before an anticipated crisis rather than kept permanently buried, though this raised another alarming question. How would NATO know when an invasion was imminent? Intelligence failures, miscalculations, or false alarms could result in the hurried deployment of nuclear landmines based on incomplete information, locking Europe into a path of irreversible escalation. The chicken heating proposal, while bizarre, highlighted the sheer improvisation at the heart of the project. Scientists initially explored chemical heaters, battery-powered systems, and even miniature generators. But each solution introduced unacceptable risks, from electrical failure to accidental ignition. The chickens, absurd as they sounded, were seen as a low-tech, reliable heat source that could function without electricity, maintenance, or human intervention. Official documents calmly described the plan. Several live chickens would be placed inside an insulated compartment within the bomb casing, along with sufficient food and water to survive for approximately 1 week, during which their body heat would keep the weapon's internal temperature above critical thresholds. The matter-of-fact tone of these reports only underscores how normalized such extreme thinking had become. The same planners who worried about thermodynamics and radiation yields casually accepted the idea of animals trapped inside a nuclear weapon as a reasonable engineering solution. Yet as the project advanced, opposition quietly grew. Some British officials began questioning whether detonating nuclear weapons on Allied soil would actually slow a Soviet advance, or simply invite immediate nuclear retaliation against Britain itself. Others worried about the political consequences if West Germany discovered the full extent of the plan. Even within NATO, tensions arose over whether such weapons aligned with alliance doctrine, which emphasized collective defense but stopped short of explicitly endorsing nuclear self-destruction as a delaying tactic. These concerns intensified as the strategic landscape evolved. By the late 1950s, both the United States and the Soviet Union had developed larger and more numerous nuclear arsenals, shifting the focus toward strategic deterrence rather than battlefield nuclear weapons. The logic of mutually assured destruction began to dominate thinking, making localized nuclear landmines seem both redundant and dangerously destabilizing. There was also the realization that any use of Blue Peacock would almost certainly trigger full-scale nuclear war, rendering its intended purpose, buying time for NATO forces, largely meaningless in the face of global annihilation. As these doubts accumulated, support for the program waned, and by 1958, Operation Blue Peacock was quietly shelved. No mines were ever deployed, no chickens were sealed inside steel casings, and the West German countryside was spared the radioactive fate envisioned by the planners. The program disappeared into classified archives, its existence denied or forgotten, until decades later when declassified documents revealed the astonishing lengths to which NATO was willing to go in order to prevent Soviet domination of Europe. Operation Blue Peacock remains one of the most unsettling examples of Cold War brinkmanship, not because it was implemented, but because it was seriously considered, engineered, and approved at the highest levels of government, exposing a mindset in which the line between defense and self-destruction became dangerously blurred. Although Operation Blue Peacock was officially canceled, its legacy lingered within NATO planning circles as a silent reference point for how far the alliance was willing to go when confronted with the possibility of defeat, and the project's termination did not represent a moral awakening so much as a strategic recalculation, driven by changing technology, shifting alliances, and a dawning recognition that the Cold War battlefield was no longer confined to tanks and infantry, but extended into missiles, satellites, and the psychology of deterrence itself. By the late 1950s, the rapid advancement of ballistic missile technology had fundamentally altered the calculus of nuclear war. Intercontinental ballistic missiles and submarine-launched nuclear weapons promised retaliation within minutes, rendering the idea of sacrificing swaths of friendly territory to delay a ground invasion increasingly obsolete. American strategists, in particular, began to argue that battlefield nuclear weapons like Blue Peacock lowered the threshold for nuclear conflict by normalizing limited nuclear use, creating a dangerous ambiguity in which one detonation could spiral uncontrollably into global catastrophe. British officials, still grappling with their declining imperial power and growing dependence on American nuclear guarantees, found themselves caught between maintaining an independent deterrent and aligning fully with U.S. doctrine, which increasingly favored centralized control over nuclear escalation. Internally, the British military establishment was deeply divided. Some senior officers viewed Blue Peacock as a necessary evil that acknowledged the grim realities of defending Europe against numerically superior Soviet forces, while others saw it as a tacit admission of conventional weakness that undermined NATO's credibility and moral standing. Declassified correspondence reveals tense exchanges in which planners debated whether the psychological impact of buried nuclear bombs might actually strengthen Soviet resolve, by confirming their narrative that NATO was willing to destroy Europe to save itself. These fears were not unfounded, as Soviet intelligence actively sought evidence of Western desperation, interpreting such plans as signs that NATO doubted its own ability to prevail in a conventional conflict. Meanwhile, advances in reconnaissance technology began to erode one of Blue Peacock's key assumptions: secrecy. The emergence of high-altitude reconnaissance aircraft and, later, early satellites raised serious doubts about whether large-scale preparations for deploying nuclear landmines could remain hidden. Soviet analysts might detect unusual engineering activity or troop movements, triggering preemptive actions or escalating tensions before a single bomb was ever armed. The British Atomic Energy Authority also raised technical objections that grew harder to ignore, warning that long-term storage of nuclear devices in unpredictable environmental conditions introduced unacceptable risks of degradation, leakage, or accidental detonation. These warnings were amplified by a series of real-world nuclear accidents elsewhere, including mishandled weapons and near-miss incidents that underscored how fragile nuclear safety systems could be under stress. At the same time, West Germany's political landscape was evolving rapidly. As the Federal Republic regained sovereignty and confidence, the idea of hosting foreign-controlled nuclear weapons designed to obliterate its own territory became increasingly untenable. German leaders publicly emphasized NATO solidarity while privately pushing back against any strategy that treated their country as a sacrificial buffer zone. This diplomatic pressure mattered because NATO's legitimacy depended on the consent of its member states, not just military necessity. As a result, Blue Peacock became an unspoken embarrassment, a reminder of a darker moment when fear had driven planners to contemplate the unthinkable. Yet its cancellation did not mark the end of battlefield nuclear concepts. Instead, those ideas were transformed and absorbed into broader doctrines involving tactical nuclear artillery, short-range missiles, and flexible response strategies that sought to preserve escalation control while retaining deterrence. In this sense, Blue Peacock served as a cautionary experiment, shaping later debates about proportionality, control, and the survivability of command structures in nuclear war. The revelation of the project decades later shocked the public precisely because it exposed how normalized extreme thinking had become during the Cold War's most anxious years, when decision-makers operated under the constant assumption that war could begin at any moment and that survival might require measures indistinguishable from self-annihilation. Operation Blue Peacock forces a reckoning with the psychological environment of early Cold War Europe, where leaders confronted the possibility that defending democracy might require destroying the very societies they sought to protect, and where the line between deterrence and desperation was thin enough to disappear entirely under the weight of existential fear. As historians later examined Operation Blue Peacock through the lens of declassified archives and oral testimonies, a deeper and more unsettling picture emerged, one that framed the project not as an isolated moment of Cold War madness, but as part of a broader pattern in which nuclear weapons were increasingly treated as tools of terrain management rather than instruments of absolute last resort, revealing how the early Cold War blurred ethical boundaries in ways that modern audiences often struggle to comprehend. In the 1950s, nuclear weapons had not yet acquired the taboo status they hold today. They were still relatively new, still poorly understood by the public, and still viewed by many military planners as simply larger, more powerful versions of conventional explosives. This mindset made it possible for concepts like nuclear landmines to be discussed with clinical detachment, stripped of the human consequences they would unleash. British planners, steeped in memories of World War II's scorched earth tactics and desperate defensive measures, approached Blue Peacock with the same grim pragmatism that had once justified destroying bridges, flooding lowlands, or leveling cities to slow an enemy's advance. The difference, of course, was scale. Where earlier wars sacrificed infrastructure temporarily, Blue Peacock contemplated sacrificing entire ecosystems permanently. The radioactive contamination projected by British scientists would not simply block Soviet tanks. It would poison soil, rivers, and aquifers, creating invisible barriers that would persist long after the fighting stopped, shaping the lives of survivors who had no say in the decision. Yet within NATO's inner circles, such outcomes were framed as unfortunate but necessary consequences of survival in a nuclear age. This framing was reinforced by intelligence assessments that consistently overestimated Soviet capabilities and underestimated NATO's resilience, creating a feedback loop in which fear justified increasingly extreme measures. War games conducted in British and American command centers routinely ended with NATO forces collapsing under Soviet pressure, reinforcing the belief that only nuclear escalation could prevent total defeat. In this environment, Blue Peacock was less an aberration than a logical extension of prevailing assumptions. If Europe was destined to become a battlefield, then shaping that battlefield with nuclear fire became a rational, if horrifying, strategy. The ethical implications were rarely discussed openly, partly because they threatened to paralyze decision-making. Acknowledging the moral cost of detonating nuclear weapons on Allied soil would force planners to confront the possibility that there were no acceptable solutions to the problem of defending Europe, a conclusion few were willing to accept. Instead, moral concerns were reframed as technical challenges: how to minimize fallout spread, how to time detonations to avoid friendly casualties, how to ensure reliability under extreme conditions. This technocratic approach allowed planners to distance themselves emotionally from the human impact of their decisions, reducing villages, farms, and cities to abstract variables in strategic equations. But cracks in this facade occasionally appeared. Some scientists involved in Blue Peacock later recalled moments of profound unease, particularly when modeling scenarios in which radioactive plumes drifted far beyond intended zones, contaminating areas deep inside Western Europe. Prevailing winds could not be controlled, and even small deviations in weather patterns could turn a localized detonation into a transnational disaster. These uncertainties haunted the project, undermining confidence in its feasibility and safety. At the same time, the growing influence of public opinion began to weigh on policymakers. By the late 1950s, nuclear weapons testing and fallout had become topics of public concern, sparking early anti-nuclear movements and raising questions about the long-term health effects of radiation. Although Blue Peacock remained secret, its underlying assumptions increasingly clashed with a world that was beginning, however tentatively, to question the unchecked expansion of nuclear arsenals. This shift in public consciousness made it harder for governments to justify extreme measures, even in private, because leaders recognized that secrecy could not be guaranteed indefinitely. A catastrophic revelation that NATO had planned to nuke its own territory would have devastating political consequences if exposed. The project's cancellation, therefore, was as much about managing future reputational risk as it was about strategic necessity. Yet even after Blue Peacock was shelved, its conceptual legacy endured, influencing later discussions about area denial, escalation control, and the use of nuclear weapons in limited conflicts. Tactical nuclear weapons deployed in Europe during subsequent decades reflected many of the same assumptions, albeit in less overtly self-destructive forms. Short-range missiles, nuclear artillery shells, and depth charges were all justified as means of slowing or deterring Soviet advances, even though their use would still devastate civilian populations and contaminate large areas. In this sense, Blue Peacock can be seen as a prototype for a broader category of thinking that normalized nuclear violence as an acceptable component of military strategy. The fact that it was never implemented does not diminish its significance. On the contrary, it highlights how close the world came to institutionalizing nuclear self-harm as a defensive doctrine. The project also underscores the fragility of deterrence itself, revealing how fear and uncertainty can push rational actors toward irrational solutions. Deterrence is often portrayed as a stable equilibrium maintained by mutual restraint, but Blue Peacock shows that this equilibrium was anything but stable in the early Cold War, when misperceptions, technological limitations, and historical trauma combined to produce strategies that bordered on the suicidal. By revisiting this episode, historians gain insight into the psychological pressures that shaped Cold War decision-making, and the ways in which those pressures distorted judgment at the highest levels. Operation Blue Peacock is not merely a curious footnote or a bizarre anecdote involving chickens and nuclear bombs. It is a stark reminder that the systems designed to prevent war were often built on assumptions that accepted unimaginable destruction as a legitimate price of security. Understanding this history is essential, not to sensationalize past follies, but to recognize how easily fear can erode ethical constraints when survival appears to be at stake, and how important it is to question strategies that promise safety through devastation. By the time Operation Blue Peacock slipped quietly into archival obscurity, the Cold War itself had begun to mutate into a far more complex and dangerous contest, one in which nuclear weapons were no longer hypothetical endgames, but ever-present tools hovering just below the threshold of use. And it was within this evolving landscape that the lessons of Blue Peacock continued to influence military thinking in subtle but profound ways. NATO's abandonment of nuclear landmines did not signal a retreat from nuclear deterrence. Instead, it marked a shift toward doctrines that sought to reconcile the apocalyptic power of nuclear weapons with the political necessity of restraint. Concepts such as flexible response emerged, emphasizing graduated escalation rather than immediate all-out nuclear war. Yet even these doctrines carried the DNA of Blue Peacock in their willingness to contemplate limited nuclear use on European soil. Tactical nuclear weapons proliferated throughout the continent during the 1960s and 1970s. Deployed in forms ranging from artillery shells to short-range missiles, all justified by the same logic that had underpinned Blue Peacock, that the threat of localized nuclear devastation might deter a larger conventional assault. The difference was one of optics and control rather than consequence. Instead of burying massive bombs beneath farmland, NATO dispersed smaller nuclear devices among its forces, embedding them within a command structure designed to signal resolve while maintaining centralized oversight. Yet this dispersion introduced its own dangers, increasing the number of potential failure points and heightening the risk of accidents, miscalculations, or unauthorized use. In this sense, Blue Peacock can be seen as a concentrated expression of a broader willingness to gamble with catastrophic outcomes in the name of deterrence, a gamble that persisted throughout the Cold War, despite repeated warnings from scientists and strategists alike. The ethical debates that had simmered beneath Blue Peacock's development resurfaced repeatedly as new nuclear systems were introduced, each time forcing policymakers to confront the same uncomfortable questions. How much destruction could be justified to to prevent a greater one? And who had the authority to make that calculation on behalf of millions of civilians? Declassified minutes from NATO councils reveal that these questions were rarely answered definitively. Instead, they were deferred, obscured by technical discussions of yield, accuracy, and command and control reliability. The language of strategy became a shield against moral reckoning, allowing decision-makers to frame nuclear weapons as abstract deterrents rather than instruments of human suffering. Yet the shadow of Blue Peacock loomed over these discussions as a reminder of how easily abstraction could slide into absurdity, how rational planning could produce plans that, when viewed from a human perspective, bordered on madness. This tension between strategic rationality and moral intuition was further complicated by the lived experiences of those who would have been responsible for executing such plans. Soldiers stationed in Europe during the Cold War trained with the knowledge that they might one day be ordered to fight in a nuclear battlefield, advancing through irradiated zones, or triggering weapons that would permanently destroy the land they were defending. Oral histories from NATO veterans reveal a mixture of fatalism, confusion, and quiet resistance. Many accepted the logic of deterrence intellectually while struggling to reconcile it with their sense of duty to protect civilians. For them, Blue Peacock represented an extreme endpoint of a trajectory they already found troubling, a stark illustration of where unexamined assumptions could lead. The collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 provided an opportunity to reassess this legacy, as newly opened archives shed light on the internal deliberations that had shaped Cold War strategy. Historians and policymakers alike were struck by how contingent many decisions had been, how often they rested on worst-case assumptions that were never fully tested. In hindsight, the inevitability of Soviet invasion that had haunted NATO planners in the 1950s appears far less certain, shaped as much by mutual mistrust and ideological rivalry as by objective military realities. This realization casts Operation Blue Peacock in a particularly sobering light, suggesting that entire regions of Europe might have been sacrificed to counter a threat that was, in part, constructed by the very fears it inspired. Yet it would be misleading to dismiss the planners behind Blue Peacock as reckless or irrational. They operated within a context defined by recent memories of total war, limited information about adversary intentions, and a genuine belief that failure to prepare for the worst could invite catastrophe. Their choices reflect the pressures of an era in which uncertainty was itself a weapon, exploited by both sides to shape perceptions and behavior. Understanding this context does not absolve the plan of its ethical implications, but it does illuminate the human dimensions of strategic decision-making, revealing how fear, responsibility, and imperfect knowledge intersected to produce outcomes that seem incomprehensible in retrospect. As the Cold War receded into history, Operation Blue Peacock took on a symbolic significance that extended beyond its immediate details, becoming a touchstone for debates about nuclear ethics, alliance politics, and the limits of deterrence. It challenged the comforting narrative that nuclear weapons were kept safely at bay by mutual restraint, exposing instead a history filled with close calls, extreme proposals, and narrowly averted disasters. In this narrative, Blue Peacock stands alongside other infamous episodes: near-launch incidents, accidental bomb drops, misinterpreted exercises, as evidence that the nuclear age has been far more precarious than official histories often admit. The revelation of the chicken heating proposal, while often treated as a humorous footnote, serves a deeper purpose by stripping away the veneer of cold rationality that surrounds nuclear planning. It reminds us that behind the diagrams, yield calculations, and doctrinal statements were human beings improvising solutions under immense pressure, sometimes crossing the line between ingenuity and absurdity without fully grasping the consequences. In this sense, the chickens become an unlikely symbol of the Cold War itself. Living creatures caught inside a machine designed for destruction, their presence both essential to its function and tragically expendable. The enduring relevance of Operation Blue Peacock lies in its capacity to provoke reflection on the assumptions that continue to shape security policy today. While the geopolitical landscape has changed, the fundamental dilemmas of deterrence remain as nations grapple with new technologies, emerging threats, and persistent uncertainties about adversary intentions. The temptation to rely on extreme measures as safeguards against perceived vulnerability has not disappeared. It has merely taken new forms, from cyber warfare doctrines to autonomous weapon systems. Blue Peacock's history offers a cautionary tale about the risks of allowing fear to dominate strategic thinking, pushing policymakers toward solutions that prioritize short-term security at the expense of long-term stability and moral integrity. As historians continue to uncover the hidden layers of Cold War planning, episodes like Blue Peacock serve as reminders that the past is not merely a record of what happened, but a repository of warnings about what could happen again if similar pressures and assumptions resurface. In the end, the most unsettling aspect of Operation Blue Peacock is not that it was conceived, but that it made sense, at least to those who lived in a world where the unthinkable felt not only possible, but imminent. That realization forces us to confront the fragility of the safeguards we trust to prevent catastrophe, and to ask whether we have truly learned from the era when burying nuclear bombs beneath friendly soil seemed like a rational defense strategy. By the time Operation Blue Peacock finally emerged from secrecy in the early 21st century, revealed through declassified British defense files and archival releases, it confronted modern audiences with a version of Cold War thinking that felt both alien and disturbingly familiar. Because while the specific technologies had changed, the underlying logic, the willingness to gamble with catastrophic outcomes in the name of deterrence, remained deeply embedded in global security structures. Public reaction to the revelation was a mix of disbelief, dark humor, and unease, with headlines focusing on the surreal image of live chickens sealed inside nuclear weapons. Yet, this fixation on absurdity often obscured the far more troubling reality. That Blue Peacock represented a deliberate, technically mature plan to irradiate Allied territory and permanently reshape Europe's geography if war broke out. Historians quickly pointed out that the project was not the result of rogue scientists or eccentric engineers, but a mainstream initiative endorsed through official channels, reviewed by senior military officers, and integrated into NATO's strategic framework, at a time when nuclear war was treated as a plausible extension of conventional conflict. This realization forced a re-evaluation of the comforting narrative that Cold War leaders consistently exercised restraint and rationality, revealing instead a pattern of brinkmanship in which extreme measures were normalized through bureaucratic processes that diffused responsibility and insulated decision-makers from the human consequences of their plans. Blue Peacock also illuminated the asymmetry of power within NATO, highlighting how the strategic priorities of nuclear-armed states could impose existential risks on smaller allies whose consent was assumed rather than meaningfully sought. West Germany, positioned at the fault line of the Cold War, bore the implicit burden of strategies designed elsewhere, its territory transformed into a theoretical battlefield long before its people were informed of the risks they faced. This dynamic echoes through later debates about alliance politics, where questions of sovereignty, burden sharing, and risk distribution remain unresolved. The legacy of Blue Peacock is therefore not confined to its technical details or its bizarre improvisations, but extends to broader issues of democratic accountability and the ethics of secret decision-making in matters of existential importance. The project demonstrates how easily strategic imperatives can override transparency, allowing governments to contemplate actions that would be politically untenable if openly debated. At the same time, Blue Peacock underscores the role of uncertainty in driving extreme planning. British and NATO officials operated in an environment saturated with worst-case assumptions, limited intelligence, and recent memories of total war, all of which amplified perceived threats and narrowed the range of acceptable responses. In such a context, even plans that entailed self-inflicted devastation could appear reasonable, even prudent. This does not absolve the decision-makers involved, but it complicates simplistic moral judgments by situating their choices within a framework of fear and responsibility that is difficult to replicate in hindsight. The end of the Cold War offered an opportunity to move beyond this mindset, as arms control agreements, confidence-building measures, and new norms of restraint reduced the immediate risk of nuclear conflict. Yet, the lessons of Blue Peacock remain relevant precisely because the conditions that produced it, strategic uncertainty, technological change, and mutual distrust, have not disappeared. Instead, they have migrated into new domains, from cyber operations to space warfare, where the temptation to adopt extreme measures in the name of deterrence persists. The story of Blue Peacock serves as a reminder that the boundary between deterrence and provocation is often thin and contested, shaped as much by perception as by objective capability. It also highlights the danger of treating complex moral dilemmas as purely technical problems, solvable through engineering ingenuity rather than ethical reflection. The engineers who proposed using chickens to heat nuclear weapons were responding to a genuine technical challenge, yet their solution symbolized a deeper failure to question the premise of the project itself. By focusing on how to make the weapon work, they avoided confronting whether it should exist at all. This pattern recurs throughout the history of military technology, where innovation often outpaces ethical deliberation, leaving societies to grapple with the consequences after the fact. In revisiting Operation Blue Peacock, scholars and policymakers are forced to confront uncomfortable questions about the relationship between security and morality, and about the extent to which democratic societies are willing to compromise their values in the face of perceived existential threats. The project also invites reflection on the role of secrecy in shaping public understanding of history. For decades, Blue Peacock remained hidden, not because it was insignificant, but because its implications were too unsettling to acknowledge. Its eventual disclosure challenges us to reconsider how many other plans, proposals, and near misses remain buried in classified archives, shaping the course of history in ways we have yet to fully understand. Ultimately, Operation Blue Peacock stands as a stark testament to the paradox at the heart of nuclear deterrence, that the pursuit of safety can lead to strategies that undermine the very foundations of human security. By examining this episode in all its complexity, its strategic rationale, its technical ingenuity, its moral blindness, we gain insight into the dynamics that have defined the nuclear age and continue to influence global politics today. The story is not merely about nuclear landmines or chickens or Cold War paranoia. It is about the choices societies make when confronted with fear, uncertainty, and the prospect of annihilation, and about the enduring challenge of ensuring that the mechanisms designed to prevent catastrophe do not become instruments of it. In the final accounting, Operation Blue Peacock endures not because it was executed, but because it was seriously contemplated, approved, engineered, and nearly deployed, exposing the raw logic that governed Cold War survival thinking and revealing how close the world came to redefining self-destruction as defense. The plan's cancellation is often cited as evidence of restraint. Yet this interpretation risks obscuring the deeper truth. Restraint arrived not through moral clarity, but through a convergence of practical concerns, political caution, and the dawning realization that nuclear strategies were spiraling beyond human control. Blue Peacock was abandoned because it was dangerous, unpredictable, and politically indefensible, not because its ethical implications suddenly shocked its creators. That distinction matters because it underscores how fragile the safeguards against catastrophe truly were, dependent less on shared values than on shifting calculations of risk. The fact that the project advanced as far as it did suggests that, under slightly different circumstances, greater fear, heightened tensions, or a single triggering event, it might have crossed the threshold from paper to reality. This realization reframes the Cold War not as a stable standoff governed by rational actors, but as a prolonged period of managed instability in which disaster was avoided through a combination of luck, hesitation, and imperfect information. Operation Blue Peacock sits uncomfortably within this narrative, a reminder that the systems designed to prevent war often carried within them the seeds of unimaginable destruction. Its existence challenges the comforting assumption that nuclear weapons were kept safely at bay by mutual understanding, revealing instead a world in which decision-makers repeatedly flirted with irreversible harm, while convincing themselves it was necessary. The project also forces a reckoning with the role of bureaucracy in enabling extreme outcomes. No single individual bears responsibility for Blue Peacock, yet the cumulative effect of countless small decisions produced a plan that would have permanently scarred Europe. This diffusion of accountability is one of the most dangerous features of modern technological power, allowing morally consequential actions to emerge without clear authorship or opposition. Blue Peacock's engineers solved problems efficiently, its planners optimized scenarios meticulously, and its administrators processed approvals routinely, all while the human cost remained abstract and distant. In this sense, the project exemplifies how large institutions can normalize extraordinary violence through procedural logic, transforming existential threats into manageable line items and technical challenges. The legacy of Blue Peacock therefore extends beyond nuclear history, offering insights into how societies grapple with risk, fear, and responsibility in an age of unprecedented destructive capability. It asks whether deterrence can ever truly be ethical when its credibility depends on the willingness to inflict irreversible harm, and whether secrecy can coexist with democratic accountability when the stakes involve the survival of entire populations. As new technologies emerge, autonomous weapons, artificial intelligence, cyber warfare, the temptation to adopt extreme measures under the banner of security persists, echoing the same logic that once justified burying nuclear bombs beneath friendly soil. The story of Blue Peacock warns that technological sophistication does not guarantee moral wisdom, and that the boundary between defense and self-annihilation can erode gradually, almost imperceptibly when fear dominates strategic thinking. It also reminds us that history's most dangerous ideas often appear reasonable within their original context, gaining legitimacy through repetition and institutional endorsement rather than overt fanaticism. In reflecting on Operation Blue Peacock, we are compelled to confront not only the past, but the present, asking how many contemporary strategies will one day appear equally incomprehensible, and how close we remain to repeating the same mistakes under new guises. The chickens sealed inside nuclear casings have become a symbol of Cold War absurdity, yet their true significance lies in what they represent: living proof that even the most irrational ideas can be absorbed into rational systems when urgency eclipses reflection. Blue Peacock ultimately reveals that the greatest danger of the nuclear age was not a single weapon or plan, but a mindset that accepted the destruction of civilization as a tolerable outcome if it delayed defeat. That this mindset was questioned, challenged, and ultimately curtailed offers a measure of hope, but it also serves as a warning that vigilance is required to prevent its return. The Cold War ended without nuclear war, not because such plans never existed, but because, at critical moments, they were set aside. Whether future generations will display the same restraint remains an open question, one that gives Operation Blue Peacock its enduring relevance as a case study in how close humanity came to engineering its own devastation in the name of survival.